Good morning, everyone, and welcome again. Like was said, my name is Sara, and it's a gift to get to be with you this morning, and a gift to spend our morning in this story. And thank you, Shiloh. That was a long text to read, and I appreciate the work that goes into that. So it's a real treat to get to spend our morning in this story. It is beautiful, and there is a lot here. So we're going to get into it. Many commentators will note that it was standard practice in Jewish households of that time to have someone at hand to wash people's feet as they came in for the evening meal. Streets were dusty, people were wearing sandals, it makes a ton of sense. The feet would need to be washed. And perhaps the disciples would have naturally felt a little bit confused and embarrassed if they realized that they had no one on hand to fulfill that office for this particular meal. And maybe, this is just conjecture, but maybe they were already looking around the room doing that thing of I wonder who should step up and kind of take one for the team on this one. Who's kind of the lowest? Maybe Bartholomew, that guy doesn't get a lot of time. And I don't know, but maybe. But if anyone had been playing that tape in their mind, surely Jesus, their master and teacher, would have not even made it into the list of possible candidates for this role. But as we just read, Jesus, unprompted, moves towards them and begins to wash their feet. And in doing so, he widens their whole world and their mission. And so today, as we spend our morning in this passage of Scripture, I want to look at three specific things that Jesus gives us in this passage. And those are a revelation, a sign, and a command. So firstly, we receive revelation. This is Jesus revealing himself and more of who he is to his disciples. Let's read again, as was just read, but just verse 3-5. It says this: Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around them. And John here is making a point of reminding us that Jesus knew exactly who he was and what was going on here. This was not an instance, as it seems like Peter maybe felt, of Jesus forgetting himself. You forget, you're the guest of honor here, you're forgetting your place or your authority. Rather, this passage helps us to see that it was in knowing exactly who he was and where he was going that Jesus chose to kneel down and wash their feet. And Jesus here, he manifests for his disciples a reality that had always been true, but they were having a hard time seeing. Perhaps because it was just so different from their expectations and hopes and what they saw in the world. And this is the reality. The Son of God is a servant. And this glorious reality that we see in Jesus serving the disciples here, we also see in Jesus on the cross. And this same reality will be sung about by the church in Philippians 2. Speaking of Jesus, it says this: who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And Daryl's teaching on this passage has helped me greatly, and so I'm going to read it. Here he says, in Philippians 2, suggests that in his pre-existent state, the eternal Son of God is contemplating what it all means. And he comes to a conclusion which none of us would have ever reached. He concludes that to be in the form of God, to be equal with the Father, means not exploiting his status for his own good, but emptying himself, taking the form of a servant. God thinks that being God means emptying himself for the life of the world. See, when Jesus washed their feet, he did not momentarily choose to lay aside his godhood. Instead, he revealed to his disciples what it really means to be king and glorious and powerful. Now, the disciples were those who were closest to Jesus. They had been walking with him for some time now, and they'd seen him heal the sick and teach with authority on things that they had never heard before. And they had been astonished by the work of Jesus already. But still here, at the end of their time together, there seems to be room to be astonished again. And I think that as followers of Jesus, we should still also expect to be surprised by him once in a while, regardless of how long or short a time we have known him. Because it's natural that his words and actions should be so different from ours. His instincts are so counter to our own. They should shock us. They should surprise us. They're also so different to what we see in the world around us. C.S. Lewis, in his book, A Grief Observe, reminds us of this. He says, "My idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time. He shatters it himself. Could we not almost say that this shattering is one of the marks of his presence? The incarnation is the supreme example. It leaves all previous ideas of the Messiah in ruins. When Jesus shows up, he shatters our illusions and expectations. And the foot washing further shatters the expectations that the disciples held for their Messiah. Who is this that so humbles himself? Can he truly be the leader and master we were waiting for?" And we, I think, like the disciples, think we have understanding beyond what we understand. We've got an idea in our heads, formed possibly by many good and beautiful things we know to be true about God, but it is a limited idea nonetheless. And I think we're unfair to the disciples if we would suggest that we would not also have been astonished by what Jesus had just begun to do and what it meant. And I think it is good and right for us to make room in ourselves to be surprised by the reality we just read once again. Because God wants to give us more of himself. And to do that, he has to shatter our images and expectations. So I'm going to say it again. Knowing he had all authority, knowing he had come from the Father and was returning to the Father, being in very nature God, he humbled himself, took off his outer clothes, wrapped a garment around his waist, and knelt down and washed their feet. This is who God is. This is how he chooses to display his glory and show his love, shattering again our ideas of greatness. Lesslie Newbigin says it this way: the master is the slave the master. To say that is to say that all normal conceptions of power and authority are overturned. The God whom we fashion by projecting onto the heavens our ideas of power and authority turns out to be a vanity, a no God. And shocking though it may be, is it not infinitely more beautiful than the vision of power and authority that we see in this world? And is it not what we most need in a king? This is the humility of God, displayed in the actions of Jesus, God made flesh. Secondly, we see that Jesus gives us in this passage a sign. We can read this story in John as a sort of signpost pointing towards the crucifixion and resurrection that are just around the corner. And now Jesus had told his disciples, and he's going to tell them again, that he would soon suffer and sacrifice himself. But I think here Jesus is aware that often to truly understand something, we need to have some experience of it. The disciples seem to be having a hard time grasping the hints that Jesus was giving them. And if you're a tactile learner, you'll know this to be true, but let's be honest, I think we just all learn better this way anyways. And past experience can help make things all the clearer when we learn things in the future. I had a rather strange experience, and to make a very long story very short, of being exposed to and finding myself in some pretty wild medical environments before I went to school for nursing. So if you can imagine like inserting yourself into like a medical drama or something, and you're seeing these surgeries and hemorrhaging and all these complex things, and I'm like, whoa, and I had some knowledge, but infinitely not enough to make sense of what I was seeing. And I had these experiences then when I went to school, where I would be sitting in these pathophysiology lectures, and all of a sudden I'd be like, oh my goodness, and this light bulb would go on. I was like, that's what was happening when that happened. Like, that makes sense now. I've seen it before. I've experienced it even. I just couldn't name what I was seeing, because it wasn't part of my reality. I had no grid for it. And maybe you've had a similar experience in some other way, where a past experience then helps you to make sense of a new reality. And I think Jesus is helping his disciples grasp and understand what is going to come. The great act of humility, the cross, it will look like defeat. Just as Jesus washing the disciples' feet may have felt like embarrassment or debasement, but it is not defeat. It is Jesus being who he has always been. The cross has always been the plan. And in helping to shape their imagination for the way in which Jesus is going to bring his kingdom and what it is going to look like, I think Jesus washes their feet. D.A. Carson says it this way: the cross was neither a mistake or a second thought, but part of his mission, indeed the central part. Quoting Jesus, he says, I have told you now before it happens, so that when it happens, you will believe. He goes on to say that the foot washing is not simply a moral example, but also a sign of the redemption and purification that he was about to accomplish on the cross. Because the foot washing not only widens our understanding of Jesus' humility, but it is also an image that Christ uses to announce his purifying work. This is not just about Jesus humbling himself, it is about what that humble sacrifice is going to accomplish. It's he who cleanses. And as he says in verse 8 to Peter, who's objecting and saying, I don't want you to do this for me. He's saying, unless I wash you, unless you can receive this, you have no part with me. Because it's for the sake of life in Christ that he cleanses us. And can we not testify today to the cleansing work of Jesus? I recently attended both the Freedom Session grad and the baptisms that were hosted at Fairview. And quick plug while I'm up here for both of those events, you don't need to know someone graduating Freedom Session or getting baptized to go. You can just go. And I didn't know who was graduating, and I didn't know who was getting baptized, but I did know that it was going to be good for me to hear again of the cleansing and life-giving work of Jesus. And it was. And again on those evenings, I heard story after story of Jesus freeing and cleansing people and bringing them into new life. And these stories, they become forefront at events like this, but they're happening all around us, my friends. And maybe the takeaway for you today is to just ask someone on your way out of this building about how God's transformed their life and what it looks like to be humble enough to receive that kind of cleansing and how it changes everything. The foot washing serves as a sign of the work and the purification of the cross and resurrection. Thirdly, and not briefly, we receive a command. Because this story is not solely about revelation of who God is and what he's up to, but it is also instruction for his people. Let's read again, starting in verse 12. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." Another teaching from Leslie Newbegin's book, The Light Has Come, he comments on a clear distinction of Jesus' command, and he notes how our natural response to all that we just heard and experienced. And I think probably this response that just sits better with us as humans would be to return the favor, to lavish upon God who has so graciously served us. But it's interesting to note he does not command our service in that way at this time. And Newbegin argues that Jesus' teaching here can be summarized like this: the debt that we owe to Jesus is to be discharged to one another. It is our neighbor who gets to be the recipient. And let us take a moment here to again note something that John makes a clear point of noting. Jesus knew with great precision what Judas was about to do, that he was about to betray him. And yet there's no indication that Judas was not also a recipient of Jesus' humble service here. Because his serving Judas was not about what Judas deserved or even about the end of Judas's story, but about who Jesus was. And there's a lot of mystery in the story of Judas, of course, but however complicated we might make it, I think the most essential thing for us to note is that Judas also received this loving service of Jesus. Because this was decision love on the part of Jesus. And this kind of humble service, not to some, but to all, is the same call that we receive from Jesus. And if we have a hard time, as the disciples did, really believing in the servanthood of God, we're likely to have an even harder time living this command. We may be able to accept the servanthood of God and turn our deeper understanding of that to praise. You can say, "I'll give you all my worship. You deserve it." But Jesus does not simply want us to recognize good in him. He wants us to become like him, to be transformed into servants who know what the master is about. Just as he sacrificed for the undeserving, so are we to do likewise. No servant is greater than his master. And as Christians, that means that we do not get to be more selective about who receives our service than Jesus was. And we do not get to expect things to be cushier than Jesus experienced. It is not promised. In fact, the opposite may be. But how often do we do this in our heart of hearts? I know I do. And maybe I don't even put it into words, because once I put it into words, I recognize how silly it sounds. But I often find myself feeling or thinking that I deserve some sort of courtesy or praise or some place at a table. Or I'll make excuses for myself of why I may get to sit out of a certain task. But that's not the call of Jesus. The call is to do likewise, to take the attitude of Christ, who went lower still. So how? How are we to serve? Because interestingly, foot washing as a practice didn't become a major part of early Christianity, and most scholars would agree that this teaching of Jesus is much more to do with having a posture of servant-heartedness towards one another. But what does that look like? And I'm not here to bring out the basins and have us all wash one another's feet, because taking on the role of servant like Christ is not about volunteering or making meals or any other individual task that we might undertake, more than it is a change in what we aspire to. It is adopting, as Philippians describes it, the attitude of Christ. It is allowing ourselves to be brought into, as Henry Nouwen refers to it, the downward pull of Christ. And it can look like a million different things in our lives, and I'm not here to be prescriptive about how you are all to be servants in your worlds. But I do also want to widen our imagination for how we can live like Christ. And when I think of people that I know adopting the attitude of Christ, I think of my friend Alf. Alf and his wife, Margaret, lived a wildly adventurous and deeply meaningful life. They started a children's ministry on the coast of BC out of a small steamship that they lived in, and it ended up blossoming into a thriving family camp that still exists to this day. And I distinctly remember one day sitting down with my family and Alf, and he was well into his 90s at this point. And all of us, were classically asking him all the questions about his life and ministry. But I noticed Alf gently resisted the chance to kind of lapse into talking about what was arguably a very noteworthy and interesting life. Instead, he would turn to my brother and I and ask us all about our lives, all about the work we were doing with kids and youth at the time. And he took such deep delight in hearing the stories of ministry happening in other places of the world, because his life, that had always been other-focused, became more so beautifully as he aged. And his delight was in the work of God happening all around him. He had ceased to consider it, grasping at greatness, and had learned to simply serve and delight in the work of God that was happening all around him. And I see the attitude of Christ in his life, but I also see it in many of you around me and the people in my life. I see it in the way my parents have pastored a small church my whole life, never trying to build something impressive or the next big thing, but just caring for the people that walked through their door, one at a time. I see it in coworkers who have no sense of bravado, but just sit with people in severe distress and addiction and just love them. I see it in the way people around me are diligently studying the Bible, not for academic praise or some sort of pat on the back, but because they genuinely desire to know Jesus and to actually help and serve people to know him better. It is not about the tasks that we are doing more than it is about who we are following and what it looks like to live the lives that we're given with his attitude. So we are to serve others. But there's another important point in this last passage that we just read that I want to make note of. And that is that this foot washing Jesus commands us to do is towards one another. And part of the humility required of being a Christian is receiving humble service from others. We need to be humble to receive what the Lord has given us, and we need to be humble to receive the care of his people. I work as a nurse, as I've mentioned. It'll always be all my stories. I can't help it. It's most of what I do. But I work as a nurse, and obviously that means a significant part of my job is helping people clean up from messes that they would so infinitely rather be able to handle on their own. And in actually the time frame of me prepping this talk, rather poetically, I was in fact washing someone's feet. And because I was working on this talk, I think my senses were heightened. I was paying more attention to it. And one thing I was so aware of is the task is the task, but while you're doing it, you're also talking. And I was so struck because the whole time I'm helping this lady, she's just apologizing. I'm so sorry. The back and forth was just I'm so sorry. And I'm like, no problem. It's no problem at all. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I was just so struck by the humility that it requires to receive that kind of care. Because for me, it's my job. It's something I'm quite used to and not bothered by at all. But for her, it was a point of humility, of vulnerability, that I think, if we're honest, few of us are prepared for. To receive loving care from others when our absolute weakness is on display is also part of this command and part of what it means to be the church. And maybe some of us here, that's what we need to hear today. Maybe humility for you today looks like admitting that you have great need and you need people to care for you and to help you, and you need God to change you and cleanse you and free you. So today, I hope and pray that we have been made a little bit uncomfortable, as the disciples were, by the humility and kindness of our God. I hope it has shocked us into remembering that the road to humility is actually the road that we long to be on. How free and joyful it can be to be in step with Jesus. And as we end, I want to return to verse 1 of this passage. It says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them until the end. This humility, this service is Jesus loving his disciples. Because love always looks like humble service. God is love. God humbles himself. And we cannot be the loving community he longs for us to be without us first humbling ourselves before God and one another.